At 16 minutes to 12, off the coast of Malaya, one torpedo struck the newest battleship in the Royal Navy low on her port quarter. She was making 25 knots, and what killed her was already inside her, turning. 200 feet of steel shaft ran from her stern to her engine rooms, passing through one watertight bulkhead after another, each of them pierced by a gland packed around it. Her builders had proved that hull against torpedoes across a decade of explosive trials so thorough they were given a job number and a file. Nobody had asked what happened when the shaft itself came loose. 26 minutes later, she hoisted the signal that she could no longer steer, and below decks, men were drowning their own magazines against a noise they had taken for a second torpedo. 840 men died in the South China Sea that morning. One survivor knew exactly what had torn her open, and for 65 years nobody believed him. If you are drawn to the great ships and the ends that found them, subscribe and stay with this one to the finish, because what sank her is not the story that was told at the time, and the man who got it right was laughed out of the room. Chapter 1. A ship named for a man who left. She was ordered under one name and launched under another, because between the order and the keel, a king walked away from his throne. The order went to Camel Laird of Birkenhead on the 29th of July, 1936, for a battleship to be called King Edward VIII. On the 11th of December that year, the man himself abdicated, and the name went with him. On the 1st of January, 1937, in a yard on the Mersey, the unbuilt ship was renamed Prince of Wales, and her keel was laid the same day. She began her existence carrying a title that had just been vacated by a man who did not want the job. She took the water on the 3rd of May, 1939, at some 31,000 tons, and the Mersey shipwrights who put her there had 4 months of peace left. 4 weeks after her launch, at the same yard, the submarine Thetis went down in Liverpool Bay with 99 men aboard. Birkenhead was a town that understood, that summer, what steel could do when it filled. What she was meant to be sat in the drawings. 745 feet long, 103 feet across the beam, 36,700 tons as built, and nearly 44,000 at deep load. 8 boilers, 4 sets of Parsons turbines, 4 shafts, 110,000 horsepower on forced draft, and a design rated to take 125,000 at overload. 28 knots on trial. 15,600 miles at 10 knots, which is far enough to cross the Atlantic 3 times and still have coal to spare, except that she burned oil, 3,542 tons of it, and she carried her own fresh water for a crew of over 1,500. She was, in the language of the day, one of the new ships. The King George V class were the first British battleships laid down since the treaties froze building in 1922, and the Royal Navy had spent 15 years waiting for them. Everything about her was the answer to a question that had been asked since Jutland, and the answers were built into her in a way that would matter later in ways nobody intended. Her engine rooms and boiler rooms alternated along her length, one after the other, so that a single hit could not take all her power at once. It was a sound idea, and it was new to British battleship practice, and it worked exactly as designed. It simply did not anticipate a killer that would travel the length of the ship rather than across her. Then, in August 1940, while she lay in the fitting-out basin at Birkenhead, with her guns half-mounted and her compartments open, a German bomb fell between her hull and the wall of the basin. It missed a 100-ton dockside crane by very little. It went into the water and exploded beneath her bilge keel, about 6 feet out from her port side, in the vicinity of the aftergroup of 5.25-inch guns. 20 to 30 feet of her shell plating buckled. Rivets sprang. Her port outboard compartments filled, and she took a list of 10 degrees against the basin wall. She flooded as badly as she did for one reason, and the reason is the whole of what follows. Her final compartment air tests had not yet been made, and her pumping system was not in operation. There was nothing aboard her to fight the water with. A local fire company and the shipyard pumped her out. And here is the detail that the men who later examined her wreck found impossible to leave alone. The reports on the repairs to that damage make no mention of any inspection of the machinery in the vicinity. Nothing about the portside propeller shafting. The bomb had gone off under her port quarter, in the exact quadrant that would kill her 16 months later, and nobody wrote down whether anyone went and looked at the shaft. That is not proof of anything, and the forensic engineers who raised it were careful to say so. It is simply a question, asked in 2012, that could have been answered in 1940 by one man with a torch. She was commissioned on the 19th of January, 1941. She was completed on the 31st of March. Read that in the other order, and you have the sentence that condemns her, because a warship is commissioned when the Navy takes her over and completed when she is finished. And for those 2 months and 12 days, the Royal Navy owned a battleship that was not yet built. The war would not wait, and so the Admiralty made a decision that appears in one line of a technical paper and is the single most important fact in the story of her death. Her completion was advanced by postponing her compartment air tests, her ventilation tests, and the thorough testing of her bilge, ballast, and fuel oil systems. Every warship afloat is a set of promises about water. The promise that a flooded compartment stays a flooded compartment. The promise that when the sea comes in, pumps will take it out again. The promise that the men below will still be able to breathe. Those promises are not made in the drawings. They are made by testing, one compartment at a time, one system at a time, before the ship goes anywhere. Prince of Wales went to sea, having never had her watertight integrity proved. Her ventilation proved. Her pumping and counter-flooding systems proved. On the 10th of December, 1941, all 3 of them failed her at once, within 30 minutes from a single hit. Her first and only captain took her over on the 15th of February 1941. His name was John Leach. He was 46 years old. He was the son of a solicitor rather than a naval family, and he had gone into the Royal Naval College at Osborne as a cadet in 1907 at the age of 12. He would command her for 299 days, from her working up to the seabed, and he would never command anything else. The last piece of her, though, was not the hull or the guns or the captain. It was a length of steel running down her spine, and the trials that had been carried out to prove she could survive a torpedo had been given a job number. Chapter 2. The trials that had a job number. The Royal Navy had spent most of a decade setting off explosives underwater to prove she could survive a torpedo. Through the middle 1930s, at test establishments and on ranges, the Admiralty ran a long program of underwater explosive trials against the protective system to be built into the King George V class. The point was to be certain. Britain was building its first new battleships in a generation, and the men designing them wanted evidence rather than opinion about what a warhead would do to the side of one. The program was thorough. It ran for years, and like every piece of Admiralty work, it was filed under a number. The number was 74. What the trials certified was genuinely good. Along the length of her belt, below the waterline, she carried a sandwich 3 layers deep. First, an empty void, so that the initial detonation had somewhere to expand. Then a liquid layer, fuel oil or seawater, which spread the pressure of the blast and caught the splinters. Then a second void, to hold whatever leakage and pressure survived the first 2. Behind all of it stood a holding bulkhead 1.5 inches thick over the machinery spaces, and 1 3/4 inches abreast the magazines. Even the plating on the outside was deliberately thin, so that a warhead striking it would generate fewer fragments to drive inward. The whole arrangement went down about 13 feet from the outer hull, and inboard of that came the auxiliary machinery spaces, another 8 feet or so of steel and equipment between the sea and anything that mattered. 21 feet of depth. The system was designed to defeat a warhead of 1,000 pounds, and it had been tested and found effective. Above it, her armour was the best Britain had ever put into a ship. 14.7 inches of cemented plate over the magazines, 13.7 over the machinery, in 3 strakes tongued and grooved into one another, so that each plate keyed into its neighbours. The belt stood 23.5 feet tall and reached 15 feet below the deep waterline, deliberately deeper than in older designs, because the Admiralty had learned that a shell striking the water short of a ship could dive under a shallow belt and come up inside her. Over the magazines, her deck armour ran 9 inches in 3 layers. Her turret faces and barbettes were 12 3/4 inches thick. There was one place she was thin, and the Navy had chosen it on purpose. Her conning tower had 4 inches on the sides and 3 at either end, because analysis had shown that captains and admirals would fight from the open bridge for the view no matter what steel was offered them. The weight was saved. On the 24th of May, 1941, that decision would kill almost every man standing around John Leach, and there was one place in her underwater protection where the system was not what the drawings promised, and it is written down in a single sentence in the standard reference on British battleships. Abreast A and B engine rooms, the auxiliary machinery spaces were left out, and a void space about 3 feet wide was put in instead. Read that again with the arithmetic attached. Everywhere else along her, 21 feet of protection stood between the sea and her machinery. Abreast 2 of her 4 engine rooms, there were about 16. B engine room drove her port outer propeller shaft, which brings the story to the shaft itself, and to the thing about warships that nobody outside the trade ever thinks about, because there is no reason to. A propeller has to turn, and it has to turn outside the hull, and the engine that turns it has to sit deep inside. So a shaft must run from one to the other. On Prince of Wales, the 2 outer shafts came out of the hull well forward of their propellers and ran in the open for a stretch, held by a bracket shaped like the letter A with 2 arms fixed to the hull before reaching the screws themselves. Inboard, each shaft went out through a stern tube packed with a gland, and then ran forward through a long, narrow tunnel, the shaft alley, the whole length of her afterbody, all the way to the engine room. That tunnel had to pass through her transverse, watertight bulkheads, every one of them, and a shaft cannot pass through a watertight bulkhead unless there is a hole in it, and a hole in a watertight bulkhead is only watertight if something is packed around the shaft to seal it while it spins. Frame 270, frame 253, frame 242, frame 228, frame 206, frame 184, the last one, the wall of B engine room itself. 6 holes in 6 walls, each of them sealed by packing around a rotating rod 17.5 inches thick, which is to say thicker through than the trunk of a mature oak, and about 200 feet long from the propeller to the turbines, which is about the length of a cricket pitch and a half. Every capital ship in every navy in the world was built this way. It was not a British failing, and nobody thought it was a weakness, because the shaft was inside the ship, inside the armour, behind the protective system, in the safest part of a heavily protected hull. Job 74 had proved the hull would hold. It had never occurred to anyone to ask what would happen if the shaft came loose. Her guns were her other strangeness. She mounted 10 14-inch guns, 4 in a quadruple turret forward, 2 in a twin turret above them, 4 in a second quadruple aft. And nobody else in the world was building 14-inch guns. Britain had committed to the caliber in October 1935, before the treaty that would require it even existed, because the guns had to be ordered by the end of that year, and the government expected a treaty to follow. One came in March 1936, signed by Britain, America, and France. Japan and Italy did not sign, and Britain declined to invoke the clause that would have let her move up to 16 inches, because invoking it meant delay, and delay meant no new battleships at all. The quadruple turret was the most complicated gun mounting in the world, over 3,000 working parts. To bring shells up into the turret at any angle of training, the design used a transfer ring between the magazine and the guns. That ring, as one of the finest naval architects of the century put it afterwards, did not have sufficient clearance to allow for the ship bending and flexing. A battleship's hull flexes in a seaway. Steel, that long, always does. The ammunition ring did not have the tolerance to flex with it. That is the whole story of what happened to her guns, and she was about to find out about it in front of the largest audience the Royal Navy had ever had. Chapter 3. 8 minutes in the Denmark Strait. At 3 minutes to 6 on the morning of the 24th of May, she opened fire on Bismarck with contractors from Vickers Armstrong's still working her turrets. John Leach had asked for them. The technicians had already been aboard during her working up at Scapa Flow, fixing one main battery breakdown after another, and when the order came to sail against the German battleship, Leach requested that they stay. That is the measure of what he knew. He was taking the newest battleship in the Royal Navy into her first action in the certain expectation that her guns would fail, and he wanted the men who built them standing by the mountings when they did. He was right. Her first 2 salvos fell 1,000 yards over because spray was breaking over her bows and her turret rangefinders could not be used. Her number 1 gun in A turret fired once and stopped. A shell arrestor jammed at ring level that had been known about and could not be cleared. In the after turret, a hoist came up with a shell and no cordite, and then a set of flash doors failed to open, and then a shell slid out of the port shell room and fouled the revolving ring and buckled a hinge tray. And the whole ring went out of action for 32 minutes while an officer fired what he could by hand. At one rammer, men kept the loading gear working by beating the tappets with a pinch bar at every stroke. That is what the newest battleship in the world looked like in her first 8 minutes of war. Of 74 rounds she was ordered to fire, she managed 55. Bismarck managed 89% of hers. Ahead of her, at 1 minute past 6, the battlecruiser Hood was hit by Bismarck's 5th salvo and blew apart. From the bridge of Prince of Wales, she seemed to collapse amidships, and the bow and the stern rose as she settled. 1,419 men died in that ship. 3 survived. Prince of Wales put her helm hard over to avoid the wreckage, and in doing so closed the range, and everything Bismarck and Prince Eugen had came onto her. She took 7 hits in a few minutes, 4 of 15-inch and 3 of 8-inch. One of the 15-inch shells came into the starboard side of her compass platform and killed almost everyone on it. It did not explode. The men there were killed by the shattered pieces of their own ship and the disintegrating nose cap of a dud driven through the space at close range. Leach was untouched. Standing near him was a young volunteer reserve sub-lieutenant named Esmond Knight, an actor in civilian life, who had just watched Hood die and who now lost his left eye and most of the sight in his right. He would be blind for 2 years. Another 15-inch shell dived under her belt amidships, punched through her side below the armour, and failed to go off. It came to rest in the wing compartments on the starboard side of her after boiler rooms, and she carried it there, unknown, for 13 days, until a hole was found above her starboard bilge keel in dry dock on the 6th of June. And the space was pumped out, and a bomb disposal officer went in and found a live German shell lying nose forward in the dark. A little after 6 o'clock, John Leach broke off the action. He had been in his first battle for about 12 minutes. The flagship had exploded beside him with 1,400 men. Most of the officers on his own bridge were dead around him. He had an unexploded 15-inch shell somewhere inside his hull, a compartment flooding below the waterline, and half his main armament was jammed or being worked with a crowbar. He made smoke and turned away, in the phrase that went into the record, pending a more favourable opportunity. He did not leave. He signalled Norfolk that Hood was gone, took station 15 miles astern of Bismarck, and became the shadower. That evening, he opened fire again at 30,300 yards and missed with all 12 salvos. Just after 1 in the morning, he opened fire again by radar, and his A turret jammed and left him 6 guns. There were people at the Admiralty who wanted him court-martialed for breaking off, or so it was said afterwards. Though the story rests on letters written years later by a retired admiral, rather than on any Admiralty file. And Leach kept his command and was given the Distinguished Service Order. What is beyond argument is what her broken guns actually did. 2 of her 14-inch shells hit Bismarck, and by one account 3. One holed the German ship's bow and cost her 1,000 tons of fuel oil to the sea and to salt contamination. The other fell short, dived, entered below the armour belt and flooded a boiler room and shut down 2 boilers. The loss of that fuel and that power was why Bismarck turned for France instead of into the Atlantic, and everything that happened over the following 3 days followed from it. The entire Bismarck chase, the most famous naval hunt of the war, turned on 2 shells fired from a ship whose guns did not work. In August, she carried the Prime Minister across the Atlantic to Placentia Bay in Newfoundland, to a meeting with the President of the United States that would produce the Atlantic Charter. On the 10th of August, 1941, there was a divine service on her quarterdeck. Churchill chose the hymns himself. For those in peril on the sea, onward, Christian soldiers. O God, our help in ages past. Roosevelt was there, and the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, and the American Chief of Naval Operations, and the First Sea Lord. Writing about it 9 years later, Churchill said that every word seemed to stir the heart, and that it was a great hour to live. And then he wrote the other sentence. Nearly half those who sang were soon to die. In September, she went to the Mediterranean and shot down several Italian aircraft with her 5.25-inch guns while escorting a convoy to Malta, which was the only successful anti-aircraft action of her life, and which taught the Royal Navy precisely the wrong lesson. She was back at Scapa Flow on the 6th of October. 19 days later, she sailed for Singapore. She was, by then, the most famous warship in the world. She had fought Bismarck. She had carried Churchill to Roosevelt. Newsreel audiences on 2 continents knew her silhouette on sight. She had 6 weeks and 4 days to live, and the reason had already been written down in a cabinet room in London by men who were arguing about something else entirely. Chapter 4. The Fleet That Was Never Coming. For 20 years, British power east of India rested on a promise that a fleet would sail from home waters, and by 1940 that promise was dead on paper. The promise had a name. It was called the Singapore Strategy, and it was the central pillar of imperial defence in the Far East from 1921 onward. Britain could not keep a fleet permanently in Asian waters because the fleet was needed in Europe and the Mediterranean. So Britain would build a great fortified naval base at Singapore instead, stock it, defend it, and in the event of a crisis, send the main fleet out from home to use it. Australia and New Zealand built their entire security policy on that sentence. The base was real, and it was enormous. 6 million cubic yards of earth moved, and 8 million cubic yards of marsh filled on the north shore of the island at Sembawang. 5,000 feet of deep water quays, 21 square miles, oil storage planned for 1.25 million tons, enough on some accounts to run the whole Royal Navy for 6 months. A graving dock, nearly 1,000 feet long, the largest dry dock in the world when it opened. 15-inch coastal guns, 3 of them able to traverse the full circle, with magazines dug in underneath. The whole thing cost about £60 million, which is something like 3 billion in modern money, and the money came from everywhere. The Federated Malay States gave 2 million, New Zealand gave 1 million, Hong Kong gave £250,000, the Sultan of Johor gave £500,000 towards the guns. And underneath all of it sat one number that nobody liked to look at, called the period before relief. It was the number of days Singapore would have to hold out alone before the fleet arrived. In 1919, the figure was 42 days. By 1938, it was 70, plus a fortnight to provision. By June 1939, it was 90, plus another 15 days to provision. By September 1939, it was 180. The number had more than quadrupled in 20 years, and it had doubled in the 3 months either side of the outbreak of war in Europe. And everyone involved kept writing it down, and nobody stopped. The base opened its great dock on the 14th of February 1938, with 42 warships in attendance, 3 of them American cruisers, and a fly-past by 2 Fleet Air Arm squadrons. In the exercises held to mark the occasion, the aircraft carrier Eagle steamed undetected to within 135 miles of Singapore and launched surprise raids on the airfields. The local air commander was, in the polite phrase used at the time, greatly embarrassed. A landing party from the cruiser Norfolk went ashore and captured the Raffles Hotel. The reports on those exercises recommended installing radar. It was not done until 1941. The year before, in 1937, the general commanding in Malaya had reported that during the monsoon months, landings could be made on the east coast, and had named the places where he expected them. Songkhla, which the British called Singora, Patani, Kota Bharu. His exercises in the south demonstrated that the jungle was far from impassable. He asked for large immediate reinforcements. He was ignored, and 4 years later the Japanese landed at exactly those 3 beaches. Then France fell, and Italy came into the war, and the Chiefs of Staff sat down in June 1940 and wrote the death certificate of the whole idea in their own hand. Formally, they wrote, they had been prepared to abandon the eastern Mediterranean and send a fleet to the Far East, relying on the French to contain the Italians in the west. Now, if the Mediterranean fleet went east, there was nothing to hold the Italians at all. They must therefore keep enough naval force in European waters to watch both the German and the Italian fleets. And they could not do that and send a fleet to the Far East. That was written 18 months before Prince of Wales sailed. Everything after it was improvisation. 2 months later, the same Chiefs of Staff worked out what holding Malaya would take without a fleet. 336 first-line aircraft and a garrison of 9 brigades. In October 1940, the commanders on the spot met at Singapore for 10 days and put the requirement for Burma and Malaya together at a minimum of 582 aircraft. On the 8th of December, 1941, the whole Far East Command had 265 frontline aircraft, of which 181 were serviceable. 79 of them were Brewster Buffaloes, an American fighter whose performance had caused it to be rejected for use in Europe. 31 of them were wildebeest biplane torpedo bombers of a design that belonged to the previous decade. There were 31 infantry battalions instead of 48. There were no tanks at all. During 1941, Britain sent the Soviet Union 676 aircraft and 446 tanks. And in November 1940, the German raider Atlantis stopped a British merchantman in the Indian Ocean and took off her, among the mail, a copy of the Chiefs of Staff Appreciation on the Defence of the Far East. It was handed to the Japanese. They read, in Britain's own words, exactly how weak Singapore was. By the summer of 1941, the Singapore strategy was a promise that everyone in London knew could not be kept, made to two dominions who had built their armies around it, defending a base that had cost £60 million and had no fleet to receive. What it got instead was decided in October in a room in Whitehall by men who could not agree on what they were arguing about. Chapter 5. The Argument in the Room. In August 1941, the Prime Minister asked for a deterrent squadron, and the First Sea Lord asked for something else entirely. The popular version of this story is simple, and it is wrong in the particulars. In the popular version, Winston Churchill overrode a United Admiralty, sent 2 ships east as a political gesture, and killed 840 men. There is testimony for it. The Deputy Director of Plans wrote afterwards that the planners were solidly against sending Prince of Wales to the Far East, that dispatching a wholly unbalanced force into an area where the enemy's strength was unknown would make her a hostage to fortune, and that they were overruled. The files say something more uncomfortable than that. Churchill's idea was borrowed from the Germans. In a fjord in Norway lay the battleship Tirpitz, doing nothing at all, and by doing nothing at all, she was pinning down superior British forces across the whole northern theatre, because nobody could be sure where she would go. A fast, modern capital ship, whose position was unknown, was worth more, he argued, than an old squadron sitting visibly in a harbour. He wanted one of the new battleships loose in the triangle between Aden, Singapore, and Simonstown, the phrase he would later use for what such a ship produced, writing about the Defence Committee meeting held on the very night before she was sunk, was a vague menace. The First Sea Lord, Dudley Pound, wanted numbers instead. He proposed the 2 Nelson-class battleships and the 4 Old Royal Sovereign class, which would give a homogeneous battle fleet of comparable speeds. Churchill thought the old ships worthless and said so with characteristic brutality. They could neither fight nor run. They were floating coffins. And here is the detail that undoes the version everyone tells. In that exchange, the only man who proposed basing capital ships at Singapore for their deterrent effect was Pound. Churchill was talking about the Indian Ocean, about trade, about commerce raiders, about a ship whose whereabouts nobody knew. Pound's plan put the heavy ships at Singapore in peacetime and pulled them back to Ceylon the moment war began. Then, in the last week of September, the Admiralty changed its mind in private. Because American ships were relieving British ones in the Atlantic faster than expected, the Director of Plans wrote that it was now feasible to adopt a more offensive strategy towards Japan earlier in a war than had previously been thought desirable. One admiral, reversing his own earlier view, argued the Eastern Fleet should operate offensively from Singapore from the first day of hostilities. On the 30th of September, these proposals were developed further at a meeting chaired by the Vice Chief of the Naval Staff. The Vice Chief of the Naval Staff was Tom Phillips, and he was already designated to command the Eastern Fleet. On the 10th of October, the Admiralty signalled the Mediterranean that a battleship, and 4 of the old royal sovereigns would go to the Indian Ocean and probably further east as soon as possible. Churchill saw the signal and minuted, in 2 sentences that ought to be better known, that this major fleet movement had not been approved by him or by the Defence Committee, and that no action was to be taken pending decision. On the 15th of October, Pound formally approved the new offensive strategy. On the 16th, the moderate government in Tokyo fell, and the Defence Committee finally met. They met twice, on the 17th of October and the 20th, because the First Sea Lord was on leave the first time, and the Admiralty case was carried by Phillips instead. The Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, and the Foreign Secretary all agreed that politically the effect they wanted would best be achieved by a modern battleship. Phillips, facing a sceptical Churchill, insisted that the old royal sovereigns were a good match for the older Japanese battleships. In February 1940, in a minute in his own hand, Phillips had assessed the Japanese fleet as 10 good ships against a Royal Navy total of 6 good and 7 poor, and had not troubled to rate the royal sovereigns at all. He had concluded that it was not a very nice position for the British Empire, even if it were not fighting Germany. 18 months later, he was arguing the opposite in front of the Prime Minister, and the contrast has gone unremarked by successive historians. On the 17th of October, Churchill asked for an aircraft carrier to be included. Nothing came of it. On the 20th of October, the Defence Committee decided to send Prince of Wales as far as Cape Town, with a review to follow on whether she went further. That was the decision. That is what the record says. On the 21st of October, 1 day later, the Admiralty informed its commands that the battleship was on her way to Singapore. On the 2nd of November, the Prime Minister was told that the First Sea Lord intended to hold the agreed review before she reached the Cape. Pound never held it. There was a carrier that might have gone, and her name has been carried for 80 years as the alibi for the whole disaster. HMS Indomitable, brand new, capable of 30 knots and 48 aircraft, ran aground on a coral reef at the mouth of Kingston Harbour in Jamaica on the 3rd of November while working up, and needed 12 days in dry dock in Virginia. She was not there when Force Z sailed, and the official Naval Staff history says plainly that it had originally been intended to include a carrier in the squadron, and that owing to her grounding none was available. The trouble is that no order to join Force Z was ever issued to her. Prince of Wales sailed from Greenock on the 25th of October, and Indomitable did not touch the reef until 9 days later, and in those 9 days there was ample time to send her orders, and nobody did. The Admiralty planning papers of that autumn show no carrier available for the Far East until April 1942. The definitive fleet strength table cleared personally by Pound on the 7th of December, 3 days before the disaster, lists 1 carrier for the Eastern Theatre, and it is not Indomitable. When the First Lord explained the loss to a secret session of the House of Commons on the 19th of December, he said the simple answer was that no carrier was available, listed 6 by name, and did not mention Indomitable at all. Pound's own report on the loss, in January 1942, does not mention her either. The historian who assembled that case put it carefully. There must be some suspicion, he wrote, that the Indomitable story rests on post hoc attempts by the men involved to suggest they were more active about the air threat than the evidence bears out. So it was settled. 1 battleship, 1 Great War battlecruiser, 4 destroyers, and no aircraft carrier, to a base at the far end of an empire, under an admiral who had spent the first 26 months of the war behind a desk. They called him Tom Thumb. He was 5'4", brilliant, impatient, unpopular with sea officers who thought him a creature of the Prime Minister, and he had not held a significant seagoing command in wartime in his life. He had also, in a conversation in Manila days before the end, told 2 American commanders that his 2 capital ships were not enough to face the Japanese. Chapter 6. What Singapore already knew. The intelligence that would have saved them was sitting in a file in Singapore with a chart of Japanese bomber ranges drawn round Saigon. The story the Royal Navy told afterwards, and repeated for 50 years, was that nobody knew what Japanese naval aviation could do. It was a comfortable story. It made the disaster a surprise rather than a failure, and surprises do not require anyone to answer for them. Here is what was on paper before Force Z sailed. On the 20th of May, 1941, the Air Ministry circulated performance tables for the Japanese Army and Naval Air Services, including the exceptional range of many Japanese naval aircraft, with the endurance of the new fighter correctly given as 6 to 8 hours. Copies went to Naval Intelligence. On the 2nd of August, Naval Intelligence itself circulated a weekly report identifying 8 Japanese airfields in Indochina, and a chart. The chart showed the operational radius of heavy bombers flying from Saigon and from Sok Trang. Singapore was inside it. The Malacca Strait was inside it. Later that month, a second report gave details of the Japanese naval heavy bomber and estimated correctly that it could carry a ton of bombs 950 miles. In about September, a group captain named Darvol put a note in front of the commander-in-chief giving Japanese heavy bombers a range of 600 to 1,000 miles with 2 tons of bombs, and the long-range fighter 1,500. The figures were in the right order. The real performance of the aircraft that would kill Prince of Wales was 2,000 pounds of bombs to 1,200 miles for the older type, and to 1,600 miles for the newer one. Against all of that, the operative British assumption, written into the record by the Admiralty's own historians, was that no torpedo-carrying aircraft had ever attacked at long range, that dive bombing had never been carried out more than 200 miles from an airfield, that high-level bombing was unlikely to do vital damage to a modern capital ship, and that reports on the ability of Japanese air personnel had for a number of years been consistently adverse. Singora and Kota Baru, the Admiralty believed, were over 300 miles from the nearest Indochina airbase. They were 475 and 425. And while those papers sat in their files, the thing that would kill her was being assembled 400 miles to the north. And it was being assembled because of a press release. Churchill announced publicly that Prince of Wales and Repulse were being sent to Singapore as a deterrent. That was the entire point of the exercise. A menace that nobody knows about deters nobody, so the world was told. The Japanese combined fleet read the announcement, and Admiral Yamamoto answered it by sending 36 of the newest twin-engined bombers in the Japanese Navy south to Indochina as reinforcement. Their crews then began training specifically to attack 2 capital ships. They practiced dropping torpedoes from below 10 meters, which is 30 feet, which is lower than the height of the ship's own bridge. They practiced long-range navigation over open ocean so that they could find and attack fast-moving warships hundreds of miles from land. A marine forensics analysis, written 70 years afterwards, called this the first time in the war that a force of bombers was specially trained and equipped for ship killing, and described the capability as unprecedented. The weapon they trained with was the Type 91 aerial torpedo, 800 kilograms in total, with a warhead of about 145, running at 42 knots. The Ordnance Department claimed it could be dropped from 500 meters. The squadrons found that only 1 in 10 ran properly from 200 meters, and only half from 100. So they made a doctrine out of going lower still. A standard attack was made from 400 to 600 meters out at 160 knots, from between 20 and 50 meters above the sea. The torpedo armed itself the instant it hit the water, and there were not enough of them. The Japanese Naval Air Arm in Indochina was so short of torpedoes that it could allocate exactly one to each aircraft. They were, as one historian put it, operating to a very fine margin and effectively committed to a single attack. If the strike failed, through fighter interference, or adequate anti-aircraft fire or good handling, there would be no second chance. 2 hours before Force Z sailed, on the afternoon of the 8th of December, the Commander-in-Chief Far East asked the head of the air section at the local intelligence bureau for an assessment of the air threat to the squadron. The man he asked was Roy Chappell. Chappell had trained Japanese naval aircrew at Yokohama in 1930 and 31. He had been air attaché in Tokyo from 1935 to 1938. He knew the people he was being asked about personally. He said Phillips could expect to be attacked by at least 100 aircraft operating from bases around Saigon. He said they would be high-level bombers, and above all, torpedo bombers. He said the Japanese Navy particularly favoured torpedo bombing and were highly trained in it. He said the attackers would be land-based because there were no carriers in the area. He was right about Saigon. He was right about the numbers. He was right about the torpedoes. The Chief of Intelligence Staff at that bureau later stated that he had no contact with Admiral Phillips or with any member of his staff before Force Z sailed. Chappell confirmed that the air section was never consulted by the Admiral or his staff at all. The one request had come from a different service, 2 hours before the ships left. The historian who assembled the file reached a conclusion that is harder to hear than ignorance. The failure of the staff to engage with Chappell, who could clearly have provided a wealth of valuable background, was negligent. The Royal Navy did not fail to find out. It failed to ask. Chapter 7. Well, we must get on without it. On the first day of the war in the Far East, the Royal Air Force in northern Malaya went from 110 aircraft at dawn to 50 by nightfall. The Japanese came ashore overnight on the 7th and 8th of December at Kota Baru in Malaya and at Singora and Patani in Siam, the 3 beaches a British general had named 4 years earlier. At Kota Baru, the Australians of No. 1 Squadron got 10 Hudsons into the air against the transports, 4 bombs apiece, and flew 17 sorties, and lost 2 shot down and 3 badly damaged. And by the end of it, 5 aircraft remained fit to fly. At Singora and Patani, where the main landings were going in unopposed, the bombers could not be sent at all. Britain had not declared war on Siam, and the diplomatic pressure not to be the first to violate Siamese neutrality was strong enough that nothing could be launched until a daylight reconnaissance had confirmed what was happening. By then, the landings were ashore. Meanwhile, the Japanese Army Air Force was over the northern airfields, and the aircraft that should have contested the landings were caught on the ground. At Alor Star, of 11 Blenheims, 2 survived the day. 60 Allied aircraft were lost on the 8th of December, most of them without leaving the Earth. Within 48 hours of the landing at Kota Baru, the Australian official history recorded, the equivalent of 3 bomber squadrons and 1 fighter squadron had been lost in the air or on the ground. That was the Air Force that was supposed to cover the fleet. At 12:30 on the 8th of December, Captain William Tennant of the battlecruiser Repulse was called aboard the flagship with the Chief of Staff, the captain of the fleet, John Leach, and the staff officers. Phillips described the operation. It was to be a raid on the Japanese communications to Kota Baru, Singora, and Patani. Get in among the transports, sink them, and get out before the air could develop. The alternatives were laid out, and they were not attractive. Stay at Singapore and be bombed at anchor, which was what had happened to the American battle line at Pearl Harbor the day before. Withdraw south and abandon Malaya to the sea. Or go. They agreed the invasion force had to be tackled. Phillips had asked the air commander for three things: reconnaissance 100 miles ahead of the force on the 9th, reconnaissance off Singora at first light on the 10th, and fighter protection over Singora at daylight on the 10th. The answer came back that night, and one line of it has been read aloud at every retelling of this story for 80 years. Fighter protection on Wednesday the 10th will not, repeat not, be possible. The same signal told him that the Japanese had large bomber forces based in southern Indochina and possibly in Thailand as well, that Kota Bharu aerodrome had been evacuated, and that the British seemed to be losing their grip on the other northern aerodromes due to enemy action. There is a live argument among historians about what those words meant. The signal answered the question he had asked, which was about fighter cover over Singora, at the far northern end of the peninsula. It did not say that no fighters existed anywhere. Two historians who went through the papers concluded that Phillips may have come away with the mistaken impression that fighter protection would not be available generally. Fighters could have covered him off Kuantan. Kuantan was 150 miles from Singapore. Two men had already offered to fly them. Flight Lieutenant Tim Viggers, acting commanding officer of No. 453 Squadron of the Royal Australian Air Force, had worked out a scheme with the liaison officer aboard Prince of Wales herself. 6 aircraft over the force at all times during daylight, working within 60 miles of the east coast, as far north as Kota Bharu. It was practical, and it was refused by Admiral Phillips. A wing commander named Wilfred Clouston of a New Zealand squadron had a second plan, called Get Mobile, which used the many airfields along the coast to leapfrog flights up and down and hold cover over the fleet through the day. It was presented at an air operations meeting and rejected out of hand by the naval personnel. 453 Squadron was then formally designated the Fleet Defence Squadron, with the specific task of providing close cover to Force Z. It was never told where the fleet was. At 5:30 on the evening of the 8th of December, Prince of Wales, Repulse, and 4 destroyers left the naval base, and at 6:30 they passed the boom at the entrance to the Johor Strait. Somewhere in that hour, with the refusal of fighter cover in his hand, Tom Phillips shrugged and said the thing that has followed him ever since. Well, we must get on without it. He signalled his fleet as they cleared the land. They were out looking for trouble, and no doubt they would find it. They hoped to surprise the enemy transports the next day, and they expected to meet a Japanese battlecruiser. Behind them, the destroyers formed the screen. Only one of the 4 had been fully worked up. The cruisers that might have thickened the escort were under repair or too slow or too far away, and the Admiralty's own history states the position without decoration. Force comprised all the effective forces at Admiral Phillips's disposal. Ahead of them, 400 miles north at Saigon, 88 aircraft sat with 1 torpedo each and nowhere to be until somebody found the ships. Chapter 8. A Quiet Night and 11 Words. For most of the 9th of December, the weather hid them, and at 4:45 in the afternoon it stopped. They had gone northeast first, to pass east of the Anamba Islands, because there might be mines in the direct route, and there were. A Japanese mine layer had already sown a field there. Then they turned north for the landing beaches, into a morning of constant low cloud and heavy rain squalls that ran on hour after hour and hid them completely. A lookout in the destroyer Vampire caught sight of an aircraft for a few seconds, just after 6:20 in the morning, and one man's few seconds in that weather was not enough to change a fleet's course, so the squadron held on north. Phillips had set himself one condition. He would carry out the operation provided he was not sighted by enemy aircraft during the 9th. He was sighted at 17 minutes to 2 in the afternoon, and not by an aircraft, and he never knew it. The Japanese submarine U-65 was on the surface 225 miles south of Pulo Condore when she saw two capital ships come out of the murk on a northwesterly course at 14 knots. She reported them. Then she shadowed them on the surface for 5 hours. Her signal took 2 hours to reach the air flotilla at Saigon, and those 2 hours are the only piece of luck the British had all day. When it arrived, the squadrons were loading bombs for a raid on Singapore harbour. They stopped, unshackled the bombs, and began the slow work of hanging torpedoes instead. It was not finished until 6 in the evening, and by then the light was going, and they went anyway, because they were frightened that the 2 British ships would get in among the invasion transports in the dark. They searched into the night in bad weather and found nothing, and came home about midnight. And the men who flew that mission did not know how close they had come to fighting an action they might have lost. Meanwhile, the weather cleared. At about 4:45 in the afternoon, the sky opened, and within the hour, force was being shadowed by at least 3 Japanese reconnaissance floatplanes catapulted off the cruisers of the covering force. The men on the bridge of Prince of Wales watched them come, one after another, and understood exactly what it meant. Their condition had failed. They had been seen. Before that happened, at about 6:25, the destroyer Tenedos was detached for Singapore, short of fuel. She carried orders to transmit a signal from the Admiral at 8 the next morning, asking for destroyers to meet the force off the Anambas at dawn on the 11th. The Admiralty's own historians, writing 14 years later, put a footnote under that fact and used a word they did not often use. It was curious, they wrote, that a signal passed to Tenedos at 4:25 before the Admiral knew he had been located, and while he still intended to attack, should have been allowed to stand when she was detached 3/4 of an hour after he knew he had been seen. It was a message written by one man and sent by another under circumstances that had entirely changed. At 6:50, he altered to the northwest. At 7:30, he altered west, towards Singora, in all probability to mislead the aircraft watching him. At that moment, Force Z was about 15 miles south of 4 Japanese heavy cruisers, which were turning from a southerly course to a northeasterly one to rejoin their own battle fleet. Neither force saw the other. The Admiralty's history allows itself one moment of speculation on the point, and it is a good one. Had the 2 forces held their original courses 1/4 of an hour longer, it would have been a night surface action between 4 cruisers and 2 capital ships in the dark, and which navy came out of it would have depended entirely on which one sighted the other first. At 8:15, Tom Phillips gave it up. He had lost surprise. The enemy would have 12 hours to concentrate his air forces, and there would be nothing left at the beaches to attack by morning. He turned for Singapore at high speed. From the battlecruiser astern of him came a signal from William Tennant, unprompted, saying that he understood how hard the decision had been and that he agreed with it. And the record notes that it cheered the commander-in-chief at a disappointing moment. It was over. They were going home. They had been out for 27 hours, and they had achieved nothing, and everyone aboard was still alive. Then, at some point between 5 and 25 minutes to midnight, a signal came in from the Chief of Staff ashore in Singapore. Enemy reported landing Kuantan, latitude 3 degrees 50 minutes north. That is all of it. 11 words and a position. Phillips thought about it, and the reasoning is on record. Kuantan was over 150 miles south of Kota Baru, which meant the enemy would not expect a force last seen far to the north to be down there by daylight. It was a key military position. It was barely off his route home, and it was 400 miles from the Japanese airfields in Indochina. On those grounds, the record says, The Admiral deemed surprise probable and the risk justifiable. At 52 minutes past midnight on the 10th of December, he turned for Kuantan and worked up to 25 knots. There was no landing at Kuantan. There had never been one. The report was false, and Tom Phillips did not tell Singapore he was going there, because to send that signal would have given away his position to anyone listening. So the Fleet Defence Squadron, sitting at readiness on an airfield 150 miles away, waiting to be told where the fleet was not told. And the Chief of Staff who had sent the 11 words had no idea that his Admiral had acted on them, and therefore did not ask anybody to put fighters over Kuantan in the morning. At 21 minutes past 2, in the dark, a second Japanese submarine found them heading south. She fired 5 torpedoes at the 2 capital ships. Every one of them missed. Then she surfaced and followed at 16 knots until she lost them at 5 past 3 and sent in her report. Nobody aboard Prince of Wales or Repulse ever knew that they had been attacked. Chapter 9. 16 minutes to 12. There was nothing at Kuantan, and the destroyer sent to look into the harbour reported complete peace. They arrived off the town at 8 in the morning under a clear sky. At 14 minutes past 5, coming in, they had passed a small tug towing 4 barges, which meant nothing to anyone at the time. Between sunrise and 7, an enemy reconnaissance aircraft was sighted. At 18 minutes past 7, the flagship catapulted off her walrus amphibian to have a look around, with orders to land ashore afterwards. That aircraft matters, and not for anything it saw. It was from the walrus, landing at an airfield, that Singapore would learn where its fleet actually was. The news reached headquarters at about 11:30 in the morning, which was 17 minutes after the first bombs had already fallen. The Destroyer Express went in to look at the harbour and signalled back that there was complete peace. One account renders her words as all as quiet as a wet Sunday afternoon. At about 25 to 10, having found nothing, Phillips decided to go back and take a proper look at that tug and its barges. He turned north and then east. It was while steaming to the eastward, the Admiralty history says, that Force Z was attacked. The Japanese had spent the morning failing to find them. At 6, 10 or 12 aircraft had gone off on a sector search with small bombs. About an hour later, the striking force followed, somewhere between 84 and 88 aircraft, depending on which record is believed, in flights of about 9, and the plan was to attack continuously, starting with a bombing run from 8,000 feet, and following it with wave after wave as each group arrived. They flew south down the 105th meridian and saw nothing at all. Phillips's undeclared diversion to Kuantan had put him well to the west and north of where they were looking. They went on until they sighted Singapore itself, and then they turned back north, and that course took them straight up the coast towards their quarry. The commander of one of the groups said afterwards that it had seemed as though they would have to report a third failure. One flight got separated and found a ship 140 miles to the southeast. 9 aircraft, with a 500-kilogram armor-piercing bomb apiece, attacked the destroyer Tenedos, alone and low on fuel and heading home, in the belief that she was a battleship. They missed her, with all of them. A 1,000-ton destroyer absorbed an entire 9-plane strike that would otherwise have been over Force Z within the hour. At 10:15, an ensign named Hawashi, flying a scout aircraft north of most of the formations, found them. He signalled their exact position. He then stayed where he was and watched, and he would still be there 3 hours later. Aboard the flagship, they knew. At 10:15, Phillips ordered the first degree of anti-aircraft readiness. At 20 past, a shadowing aircraft was sighted from Prince of Wales. At 26 minutes past 10, Repulse picked up an aircraft on her radar bearing 220 degrees. They had been found, and they knew they had been found, and the fighters were 90 minutes away at Sembawang with their pilots strapped in. Tom Phillips did not break radio silence. At 11 o'clock, the contact was broadcast to the striking force and to headquarters, and the flights that had spent all morning searching turned onto a bearing. At 13 minutes past 11, every ship in the force, except one small destroyer, which was outranged, opened fire on 9 aircraft coming in from the starboard bow at 10,000 feet. They came for repulse. The Admiralty history describes their approach in a phrase that carries a good deal of feeling. Quite unperturbed, the enemy concentrated on the battlecruiser. Their formation was very well kept, and the bombs were dropped with great accuracy, Tennant wrote. 1 fell just clear to starboard, 7 fell very close to port, and 1 struck the port hangar and burst on the armour below the Marines' mess deck at 22 minutes past 11. It started a fire on the catapult deck and fractured a steam pipe, and it did nothing whatever to the boilers or the engines, and the fire was out before the next attack. Repulse held 25 knots and stayed in fighting trim, and her damage control officer got his men onto the fire, and her second walrus, damaged in the attack, was heaved over the side to get the petrol off the ship. Tennant, watching the bombing patterns, worked something out that was entirely correct. The enemy, he thought, probably knew that bombs of that size had little chance of penetrating a modern battleship's horizontal armour, and were therefore confining their high-level attacks to him, which meant that something else was coming for the flagship. On the compass platform of Prince of Wales, at about 22 minutes to 12, a lieutenant commander named Harland drew the Admiral's attention to aircraft on the port side, low down, and suggested to him that this was a torpedo attack. Tom Phillips answered him, "No, they're not. There are no torpedo aircraft about." At 41.5 minutes past 11, the ship opened fire on 9 torpedo bombers coming in from the port side. They dropped from between 30 and 35 metres, at ranges between 600 and 1,500 metres. 8 weapons went into the water, and Prince of Wales began a slow turn to port to comb the tracks and get her bow between them. 7 of them went past her. At 16 minutes to 12, she was hit on the port side aft. The paymaster lieutenant, keeping the action log on the compass platform, wrote the time and then the words, and he carried that rough sheet of paper into the sea with him and copied it out fair when a destroyer pulled him from the water. Hit by torpedo on port side aft of the bridge, exact position not known. 30 seconds later, an aircraft came down into the sea, close on the starboard side. At 11:45, a torpedo went past her starboard quarter from forward to aft, close enough to see. At half a minute past 10 to 12, a second aircraft was reported down. And then, underneath everything he had written, the log carries a single line that has none of the precision of the rest. At this stage, a heavy list to port had developed. Chapter 10. The noise they took for a second torpedo. In B engine room, the turbines began to vibrate, and thick yellow fumes came pouring down the ventilation trunk. Lieutenant Dick Wildish had been appointed to Prince of Wales in 1940, before she was finished, as her damage control officer. He had run her emergency repairs after the Denmark Strait. He was 26 years old, and he was now standing in the compartment at the inboard end of a shaft that had just been blown apart at the other end, 200 feet away, and he did not know that. What he knew was that there had been an appallingly powerful explosion, that the ship had shaken violently, that yellow fumes were coming into his space, and that his turbines had started to vibrate. The torpedo had struck at about frame 280, just abaft the stern tube where the port outer shaft left the hull. It tore a hole about 4 meters high and 6 meters wide. The explosion under the stern tended to lift the stern, but the great weight of the after turret and its barbette armor resisted the lift, so instead of flexing, the structure around it tore. The arms of the A bracket that held the shaft were weakened. The shaft itself was damaged, and the ship was doing 25 knots, and the shaft was turning at 204 revolutions a minute. At 14 minutes to 12, Wildish had the emergency bulkhead stop valve tripped and shut off the steam. A minute later, he put 100 pounds of astern steam on the shaft to stop it. It was not enough, and it could not have been. With the ship still running at 25 knots, the water going past the propeller kept it windmilling regardless, and stopping something that heavy turning, that fast, takes real power. All the astern steam did was add strain to the bolts holding the flanges of the shaft together. Then, at 11 minutes to 12, Dick Wildish made a decision that any officer in the Royal Navy would have made, and it finished her. He did not know what condition his shaft was in outside his own compartment, because he could not see it and nobody could tell him. He did know that the ship was under air attack and needed to maneuver. So he brought the turbines back on and worked the revolutions up to 158. The forensic reconstruction of what followed is unusually cold. Restarting the shaft continued the process of deforming bulkheads and destroying stuffing glands within the outer port shaft alley. The outer propeller and the strut hub began to pull away from the hull, causing the strut arms to fail. Somewhere out beyond the stern tube, a bronze screw as tall as a house came off its bearing and started to swing. Vibration ran up the shafting. The shaft came loose from its remaining pedestals and its bearing covers. The bolts joining the flanges of a 17.5-inch line shaft failed, and the shaft came apart inside its own tunnel. And then it went to work on the ship. Frame 270, frame 253, frame 242, frame 228, and frame 206, the after and forward walls of Y-action machinery room. One after another, the glands were wrecked, and when divers photographed them 68 years later, they found the openings misshapen and elongated, stretched out of round into ovals by a shaft that had beaten against them until they gave. The watertight integrity along the port outboard shaft had been completely compromised. There was now a direct conduit for progressive flooding from the sea to the heart of the ship, and the last gland to go was at frame 184, which was the wall of B engine room where Wildish was standing. Somewhere in the dark, along that tunnel, a stoker named James watched an unsupported line shaft come apart between its bearing blocks and fall onto a turbo generator. In the diesel dynamo room, an engine room artificer named Williams reported water and steam coming in together, and a very loud noise which sounded, he said, similar to the reciprocating motion that a large diesel might make. There was no diesel making that noise. It was the shaft. Aboard a warship under air attack, men in a sealed compartment cannot see the sea or the sky. All they have is sound and the angle of the deck. And along the port side aft, in the magazines serving the two after port turrets, the crews heard a horrendous knocking and the sound of the ship being beaten from the inside, and they made the only judgment the noise allowed. They believed a second torpedo had struck in their part of the ship. So they did what they had been trained to do when fire and shell were about to meet in a confined space with cordite in it. They flooded their magazines. Everyone. All the powder and all the shell rooms serving those turrets, filled deliberately by men doing their duty against a hit that had never happened. That is how the list reached 11.5 degrees. There were 8 generators in the ship, 6 turbo dynamos and 2 diesel dynamos, each of 330 kilowatts. By 19 minutes past 12, when the second torpedo attack began, 3 were still running. 5 of 8 gone in 35 minutes from one torpedo. With them went the after 5.25-inch turrets and the radars and the steering gear. Able seaman Alan McIver was in a port turret when it happened. Suddenly, there was a tremendous explosion, he said. I can best describe the noise as tons of plate glass shattering on a pavement. Immediately, we lost all power to our gun. The crews tried to train the after turrets by hand, with chains, and could not because of the list. The forward starboard turrets still had power and could not depress their guns low enough to reach an aircraft coming in at 30 feet. Of 16 dual-purpose guns, one mounting was left doing useful work, and her 3 14-inch turrets, the reason she existed, were never used at all that day. The pumps could move 8,900 tons of water an hour, and now had no power to do it with, and the emergency diesels would not run. Ventilation failed in a ship already too hot for her own crew. Internal communications broke down so badly that damage control parties could not be directed to the flooding. At 2 minutes past 12, Dick Wildish came up the ladder last, dogged the hatch behind him, and watched water ooze out around its edges. It was an overhead hatch. For water to come out of it meant the compartment below was already full to the deckhead. He had the shipwrights shore it down, a lesson he had learned patching this same ship after Bismarck. At 17 minutes past 12, the first steering motor was off, and the second could not be started. At 10 minutes past 12, 26 minutes after one torpedo, John Leach hoisted the black balls that tell every ship in sight that his own is no longer under control. The men who reconstructed all this from the wreck wrote one sentence to sum it up, and it is the truest thing anyone has ever written about that morning. It had taken just one torpedo and less than half an hour to turn the pride of the British Navy into an unresponsive, indefensible wreck of a ship. And Leach still had one decision left, and both answers to it were fatal. To get the list off her, he had to counter-flood the starboard side, which meant filling the voids of the very torpedo defense system that was supposed to absorb the next hit. He did it reluctantly, and it brought her back to 9 degrees. And it meant that when the torpedoes came in from starboard 40 minutes later, the system had water in it where it needed air, and the energy of the explosions went into the ship instead. Chapter 11. 125 minutes. Repulse had combed the tracks of at least 15 torpedoes, and her captain had done it by holding course until the last possible second. William Tennant had been the senior naval officer ashore at Dunkirk. He had walked those beaches with a megaphone for 8 days, looking for British troops, and had come off with the last ships. And 26 days later, he was given this battlecruiser. And now he was handling a great war capital ship like a destroyer. His method was simple, and it required nerve. We were steaming at 25 knots at the time, he wrote afterwards. I maintained a steady course until the aircraft appeared to be committed to the attack, when the wheel was put over and the attacks providentially combed. He also, at 2 minutes to 12, did the thing his admiral would not. Uncertain what the flagship had sent, and unable to get an answer out of her, Tennant made an emergency signal in plain language on his own authority. Enemy aircraft bombing and his position. It reached the war room at Singapore at 4 minutes past 12 and the Air Headquarters Operations Room at 19 minutes past. It was the first indication anybody in Singapore had of where Force Z was, since it had sailed 42 hours earlier. Every fighter that flew that day flew because a captain went round his admiral. Then Tennant did something else, and it killed his ship. At 10 minutes past 12, he saw the flagship hoist her not under control balls, and he came down to 20 knots and closed her to see whether he could be of any assistance. By 19 minutes past, He was within 850 yards of her, which put him, at that exact moment, in the path of 26 torpedo bombers coming in from the east. His own account of what happened is the best description of the tactic that anyone on either side ever wrote. About 8 aircraft appeared low on the horizon on his starboard bow, and being low down, it meant torpedoes. At about 3 miles, they split into 2 formations. He judged that the right-hand group would drop first and started swinging to starboard to comb them, and they dropped at 2,500 yards, and it seemed obvious that he would get away with it again. The left-hand formation appeared to be making straight for the flagship, which was then abaft his port beam. And when they were a little before his port beam, at about 2,000 yards, they turned straight at him and fired their torpedoes. He was already committed. Any alteration of course to avoid the second set would have put him into the tracks of the first. One torpedo fired from my port side was obviously going to hit the ship, he wrote, and it was possible to watch its track for about a minute and a half before this actually took place. A minute and a half is a long time to stand on a bridge and watch. She took it amidships to port and stood it well, and went on manoeuvring at about 25 knots. Then a second hit near the gunroom and jammed her rudder, and though she could still steam, she could no longer steer, and at that point, everything else was arithmetic. 3 more torpedoes hit her almost together, 2 to port and 1 to starboard, and Tennant knew. The decision for a commanding officer to make to cease all work in the ship below is an exceedingly difficult one, he wrote, but I felt very sure that she would not survive 4 torpedoes. He ordered every man on deck and the Carly floats cast loose. She stayed up for 6 or 7 minutes after he gave that order, and he believed to the end of his life that those 6 or 7 minutes, and the fact that the broadcast system was still working, were why so many of his people got out. They had been warned 24 hours earlier to wear their life-saving gear, and they had. When she had a list of 30 degrees, he looked over the starboard side of his bridge and saw his commander and 200 or 300 men gathering there. I never saw the slightest sign of panic or ill discipline, he wrote. He called down and told them how well they had fought the ship and wished them good luck. She hung at 60 or 70 degrees for a minute and a half or 2 minutes, which is long enough for a man to look up at a hull standing over him like a cliff. And then she rolled over at 33 minutes past 12. 27 officers and 486 men went with her. The flagship had 3 more minutes of her own life to spend before the same aircraft reached her. At 23 minutes past 12, 2 torpedoes struck her starboard side seconds apart, one close to the stem and one right aft, and a third came in under the compass platform a minute later. They straightened her up. The list came off her, down to 3 degrees, and it was the worst thing that could have happened, because the hit aft had jammed her remaining good propeller shaft and driven a hole 36 feet by 13 into her middle and lower decks, and those decks were now below the water. At 12:30, she had 1 engine room still turning. Then 9 aircraft came over at height, and at 44 minutes past 12, 1 500-kilogram bomb hit her, and it did not pierce her armoured deck. It did not need to. It came through the upper deck and burst in a flat that had been turned into an aid station where up to 300 wounded men had been carried and laid out. Most of Prince of Wales's dead died there, in a space chosen because it was safe. From the compass platform, an officer left the only description anyone has of the last hour on that bridge. Some guns in the forward group still going. Again, steady formation of 9, waited for bombs to arrive, Captain said to Admiral Now, and we all laid flat. Pattern hit ship aft. The Commander-in-Chief remained on the compass platform throughout. At 10 minutes to 1, Phillips signalled Singapore for all available tugs. At 1 minute past 1, Leach repeated it. At 7 minutes past 1, Phillips sent it a third time. 3 signals in 17 minutes from an admiral and a captain asking for tugs to tow a 43,000-ton battleship 150 miles home on the third day of a war, under an air force they had been told could not reach them. The destroyer Express came alongside her starboard quarter, and her captain drove her hard up against the battleship's side, and men threw doors and boards and gangplanks across to make bridges, and the wounded went over. At about 10 past 1, all shafts stopped. The order went round to inflate lifebelts and abandon ship. At 1:15, the list began to increase quickly. At 20 minutes past 1, Prince of Wales rolled over to port, floated for a few seconds upside down, and went down by the stern. As she went, she caught the destroyer alongside her with her bilge keel. Express had to go full astern to clear, and heeled hard over, and very nearly went with her. Just before the ship capsized, Tom Phillips turned to his coxswain and told him to get down and out of it. The coxswain lived. Nobody saw the admiral again. A lieutenant of the Volunteer Reserve, swimming for the destroyer, came upon the body of John Leach floating in the water. He and some seamen tried to tow him for 10 minutes and could not manage it. He was certain the captain was dead. At 18 minutes past 1, as the battleship went over, 10 Brewster Buffaloes of No. 453 Squadron arrived overhead. They had taken off 11 minutes after the signal reached Singapore. It had taken 2 hours and 5 minutes for anyone to send it. Chapter 12. The Men Who Were Saved. The Japanese formations stayed overhead for the rescue and did not fire on the destroyers or the men in the water. The Admiralty recorded it without comment, which is its own kind of comment. Several formations of enemy aircraft were in the vicinity, but no attempt was made to bomb or machine gun the destroyers or survivors, and the commanding officer of Electra expressed the opinion that they purposely refrained from any hostile act during the rescue work. The narrative published in 1948 lists it among the observations of the action in a single line. No attempt was made to interfere with the rescue of survivors. 3 destroyers spent the afternoon picking men out of an oil slick 2 capital ships wide. Electra took 571 men out of the water. Vampire took 9 officers, 213 ratings, and 1 civilian war correspondent. Express, still afloat after nearly being rolled under, took the bulk of the battleship's company and left at 2:15, so full she could take no more. Men who had been pulled out of the sea an hour earlier went straight back to work. Gunners from Repulse manned 2 of Electra's 4.7-inch mountings so that her own sailors could be freed for rescue. Repulse's dentist went to help her medical teams. Above them, the fighters that had arrived too late did the only thing left to do. Tim Viggers, the man whose plan to keep 6 aircraft over the fleet had been refused, flew low over the survivors for an hour, and the next day he wrote a report to the Commander-in-Chief, which was later printed in full in the official record, and there is nothing else quite like it in the literature of that war. He said he had the privilege to be the first aircraft to reach them. He said privilege deliberately, and explained why. He had seen Spirit over Dunkirk, and in the Battle of Britain, and in the London night raids, and he had never seen anything comparable to what he saw that afternoon. It was obvious, he wrote, that the 3 destroyers were going to take hours to pick up those hundreds of men clinging to bits of wreckage and swimming round in the filthy, oily water. Above all this, the threat of another bombing and machine gun attack was imminent. Every one of those men must have realized that. Yet, as I flew round, every man waved and put his thumb up as I flew over him. After an hour, lack of petrol forced him to leave. During that hour, he wrote, He had seen many men in dire danger waving, cheering and joking, as if they were holidaymakers at Brighton, waving at a low-flying aircraft. He apologized at the end for taking up the Commander-in-Chief's valuable time, but thought he should know of the incredible conduct of his men. The next day, a Japanese lieutenant named Haruki Iki, who had flown one of the torpedo bombers against Repulse and had come home with 17 bullet holes in his aircraft, flew back out to the position alone and dropped 2 wreaths of flowers into the sea. One for his own dead, one, in his words, in respect to all the ratings from Repulse and Prince of Wales who had perished. When the destroyers got back to Singapore that night, the air commander met William Tennant on the quayside. He had one thing to say to him. "My God, I hope you don't blame me for this. I had no idea where you were." In London, the telephone rang beside Winston Churchill's bed. The First Sea Lord was on the line, and his voice sounded odd, with what Churchill described as a sort of cough and gulp. "Prime Minister," he said, "I have to report to you that the Prince of Wales and the Repulse have both been sunk by the Japanese. We think by aircraft. Tom Phillips is drowned." Churchill asked whether he was sure it was true. "There is no doubt at all." 9 years later, he wrote what he did next, and it is the most naked sentence in his 6 volumes. In all the war, he wrote, he never received a more direct shock. As he turned over and twisted in bed, the full horror sank in. There were no British or American ships in the Indian Ocean or the Pacific, except the American survivors of Pearl Harbor, hastening back to California. Over all that vast expanse of waters, Japan was supreme, and they everywhere were weak and naked. He told the House of Commons the bare fact that same day, and the whole of it the next, and in the middle of that speech, he did something that closed a door which has never since been opened. He defended the operation. Phillips, he said, had been undertaking a thoroughly sound, well-considered offensive operation, not indeed free from risk, but not any different in principle from many similar operations carried out repeatedly in the North Sea and the Mediterranean. There was never a court-martial, and there was never a formal inquiry into the decisions that put those ships where they were. Both captains of record were dead. The Prime Minister had exonerated the operation in Parliament before any investigation could begin, and 9 weeks later, Singapore fell, and the command that would have convened an inquiry, along with the base and the files and most of the witnesses, was captured or scattered. Which brings this to the part of the story that is almost always left out. 2,081 men were rescued on the 10th of December, and almost all of them were landed at Singapore. On the 15th of February, 1942, Singapore surrendered. About 130,000 Commonwealth troops went into Japanese captivity across the campaign. Some 210 Royal Marines from the 2 ships were formed into a naval battalion and merged with the survivors of a Highland regiment into a composite unit the men christened the Plymouth Argylls. They guarded the naval base and the wireless station. 40 of them went up country before Christmas for demolitions and delaying actions. In February, they fought along the roads towards Tenga Airfield, partly surrounded by tanks. 31 of them were killed in action, died of wounds, or were lost at sea, helping to evacuate civilians to Sumatra. 22 reached Ceylon. Most of the rest went into the camps and onto the Burma Railway. The destroyers did not last either. Electra, which had pulled 571 men out of the water, was sunk at the Battle of the Java Sea 11 weeks later, defending a crippled cruiser. She went down by the bow with her ensign still flying, and fewer than 60 of her men survived the sinking and the war. Vampire was sunk by Japanese carrier aircraft off Ceylon in April. Tenedos, the little destroyer that had absorbed a full 9 plane strike meant for the fleet, was sunk in the air raid on Colombo the same week. The names of the 840 are inscribed on the Naval Memorial at Plymouth. The stone raised for them in Staffordshire records one further line, and it is the coldest sentence on it. Many survivors of this battle died as Japanese prisoners of war. Chapter 13. The stoker nobody believed. In 1942, a stoker told a High Court judge that the port propeller shaft had broken, and the naval architects in the room did not accept it. The inquiry he was speaking to was chaired by Mr. Justice Bucknell, the same man who had inquired into the loss of Hood. It was a technical body. Its remit was why the ship sank, not why she was where she was, and it did its technical work carefully, and it got the answer wrong. The committee could not explain the flooding. Rapid, extensive, in two distinct areas of the ship, out of all proportion to a single hit. So it reasoned backwards from the damage to the cause, and concluded that flooding of that speed and extent in two separate places could not have been produced by fewer than 2 torpedoes. It therefore found that a second weapon had struck almost simultaneously abaft Y turret, and that the 2 explosions had been heard as one. Both of the contemporaneous British records said otherwise. The Compass platform narrative, written on the bridge as it happened, recorded 1 hit to port and 3 to starboard. The gunnery officer's own post-action statement said the same. 4 hits. The committee overrode its own eyewitnesses because 4 hits did not explain what the ship had done. And a stoker, called to give evidence, said that he had been in Y-action machinery room and had seen the shaft break. The senior naval architects and marine engineers examining his testimony found it difficult to believe that a line shaft 17.5 inches thick would actually break. It was, on the face of it, an absurd thing for a man to say. Steel that heavy does not snap. He was a stoker describing a structural failure to a room of men who had spent their careers calculating exactly what steel that heavy could take. His evidence was set aside, and the 2 torpedo finding went into the record, and there it stayed. In 1966, a Royal Navy clearance diving team spent 11 days over the 2 wrecks. They found that the propeller for the outer port shaft was missing, and that the bare shaft had pulled away from the ship, snapping the strut arms in the process. The evidence was in the water in 1966. Nobody put it together for another 41 years. In May 2007, 8 divers on closed-circuit rebreathers went down on both wrecks over 13 days and made the first detailed survey of the hull of Prince of Wales that had ever been attempted. They called the expedition Job 74. That was not an accident. They named it after the trials of the 1930s that had certified her protective system as sound, and their own report says why, in a sentence with a good deal of quiet anger in it. In the very first real-life test, the anti-torpedo protection system incorporated into the hull of Prince of Wales as a result of Job 74 proved woefully inadequate. What they found, working along a hull lying upside down in 68 meters of water, rewrote the whole thing. There were 4 torpedo holes, not 6, 1 to port, aft, at about frame 280, 3 to starboard, at the bow, amidships abreast B turret, and right aft. The enormous areas of damage that had been read for decades as evidence of further hits turned out to be dishing and seam splitting from near misses, 65 meters of it along the starboard side and 70 along the port, with no penetration anywhere in those stretches. 3 of the 4 hits had struck outside the area the protective system covered at all. On the 4th, the holding bulkhead appeared to have held, and in the first attack there had been 1 torpedo, not 2. There is no hole beside the afterport turrets. The immense column of water that so many men saw erupt there was, the forensic team concluded, almost certainly a second weapon detonating in the water close to the hull, milliseconds after the first, set off sympathetically by its shockwave. Then, in 2008 and again in 2009, a diver named Craig Challen took a high-definition camera into the port outer shaft tunnel and photographed the whole length of it, all the way forward to the after bulkhead of B engine room. He photographed the glands, stretched into ovals. He photographed the shaft. Outside the hull, the port outer propeller was gone, and so was the A-bracket, and about 17 meters of shafting had separated and fallen away, tearing the stern tube out of the hull with it. Inside, along that tunnel, was the record of what had happened in the 18 minutes between 16 minutes to 12 and 2 minutes past. The men who wrote it up put it in 4 words, with an exclamation mark, which is not a punctuation mark that appears often in marine forensic papers. Stoker James was correct. He had been the only survivor whose testimony correctly described a complete shaft failure, and he had been disbelieved by a High Court judge and a room of experts, and it took 65 years and a camera at 200 feet to prove him right. Dick Wildish, the young lieutenant who had restarted those turbines and then been the last man out of B engine room, was wounded when she sank, survived, was posted to the naval base at Singapore, and got out on a destroyer before the surrender. He became a vice admiral and deputy second sea lord. He gave his account to the forensic team, and it runs through their paper in his own words, and the phrase he used for the noise the shaft made has stuck to the story ever since. He called them expensive noises. He died on the 2nd of April, 2017, aged 102. He had joined the ship before she was finished, patched her after Bismarck, stood in the compartment where she died, and lived long enough to see the argument settled and his own account confirmed. Chapter 14. What the Sea Keeps. She lies upside down in 68 meters of water, 61 nautical miles east of Kuantan, with her port side buried along her whole length. Repulse is about 9 miles from her, in 54 meters, also inverted, her starboard side raised and her port side in the sand. The seabed there is soft. The battleship's starboard deck edge stands about 5.5 meters clear of it amidships, and that is the only part of her a diver can see without digging. Both wrecks remain the property of the Crown. Buoys are secured to their propeller shafts, flying white ensigns, renewed periodically by divers who go down for that reason alone. Every Royal Navy ship that passes the position holds a service. On the 10th of December every year, there are services in Britain too. The battleship was designated a protected place under the Protection of Military Remains Act in 2001, and the battlecruiser in 2001 or 2002, depending on which record is read. A protected place may be visited and may not be disturbed. Look, and do not touch. It has proved to be words on a page. The Act reaches British waters and British nationals and British-flagged vessels, and these 2 ships lie in international water inside another country's economic zone, and a foreign-flagged crane barge working over them is entirely beyond its reach. An analysis published in 2025 put the underlying problem in a single flat sentence. In British law, there is no such thing as a war grave or final resting place for military personnel lost at sea. These sites are indeed maritime graves, but in name only. The Ministry of Defence surveyed both wrecks by remotely operated vehicle in March 2019 and concluded that the Act provided insufficient protection given the high degree of unauthorised salvage and that a more robust regime was urgently required. The survey team also noticed something while they worked. There were depth indicator lines in the water with fresh leaves still on them. Salvage was going on during the government's own survey. The reason is a peculiarity of the atomic age. Steel smelted before the first atmospheric nuclear tests is not contaminated by the isotopes that entered the air afterwards, and were then drawn back into every furnace on Earth. Pre-war steel is therefore valuable for the most sensitive scientific and medical instruments, and the largest available reservoir of it in the world is sunken warships. Between December 2022 and March 2023, a Chinese-flagged crane barge of some 8,000 tons worked over both wrecks. She transmitted her position normally while transiting and went dark within 100 miles of the site, reappearing about a week later on her way back to port, which defeated the maritime intelligence centres of two countries at once. The method was explosives on the wreck, then a grab crane mining the fragments. In May 2023, Malaysian police raided a scrapyard in Johor. The operator had posted a video of the offloading. Among the British-made ammunition, the hull sections, an anchor, and two 5.25-inch anti-aircraft guns, they found human remains, most likely of those who died in 1941. 23 years earlier, a Member of Parliament had stood up in Westminster Hall to talk about the plundering of these same two ships, and had reached for the only comparison that fitted. Some of the things that have been taken away, he said, amount not to taking the handles off coffins, but to opening them and stripping the rings off fingers. A survivor quoted in the same debate put it more simply, "You wouldn't have people taking handles off coffins, would you? Why is this any different?" On the 11th of December, 2023, 82 years and a day after the sinking, a memorial was dedicated on the beach at Teluk Cempedak, near Kuantan, by the King of Malaysia, who is also the Sultan of Pahang. It records the 840, and it locates them 61 nautical miles to the east. Among the guests was Henrietta Wood, granddaughter of Captain John Leach. The centrepiece of that memorial is a kedge anchor from HMS Repulse, recovered by the Malaysian authorities from the men who had stolen it. The looting built the monument. In September 2025, the new HMS Prince of Wales, an aircraft carrier, held a service over the wreck of the ship whose name she carries. A sub-lieutenant of the Japanese destroyer Akebono laid a committal wreath into the water. 84 years after Haruki Iki dropped his two wreaths on that spot, a Japanese officer laid another from the deck of an aircraft carrier, which is the exact type of ship that killed her. And there was a boy on the quayside at Singapore. Midshipman Henry Leach was 18 years old. He had been appointed to Prince of Wales and then moved to a cruiser so that a father and son would not serve in the same ship, and the cruiser was refitting at Singapore, so he was ashore as a plotting officer in the local war room. 2 nights before the end, he and his father had a gin sling and a swim together. When the destroyers came in that night, survivors remembered a forlorn midshipman walking among the oil-covered men on the quay, asking after his father. 41 years later, Admiral of the Fleet Sir Henry Leach was First Sea Lord, and he stood in front of a Prime Minister who had just lost a group of islands in the South Atlantic, and told her that a task force could be assembled and the islands could be taken back. She sent it. It went with air cover. The ship his father commanded lies upside down in the warm dark with her port side in the sand, and inside her, along a tunnel 200 feet long, the shaft is still there, in pieces, at the frames where it stopped. 17.5 inches thick. 204 revolutions a minute at the instant the torpedo reached her, and 158 for the 18 minutes that followed, and nobody aboard her ever knew what the noise was. She had been given the answer once, in a signal, on the night before she sailed. Fighter protection on Wednesday the 10th will not, repeat not, be possible. And a small, brilliant, exhausted admiral had read it, and shrugged, and said the only thing left to say, "Well, we must get on without it." They did. It took 125 minutes. Tim Viggers, flying low over the men in the water with his fuel running out, found the words that outlasted everybody's. "It shook me," he wrote, "for here was something above human nature. I take off my hat to them, for in them I saw the spirit which wins wars." If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe, because the sea has a great many of them, and most have never been told properly. And tell me this in the comments. If you had been on that bridge at 10:15 that morning, knowing a Japanese aircraft had just found you, and knowing your fighters were 90 minutes away, would you have broken radio silence, or would you have kept it, as he did? I want to know where you land, and why.